Silence didn't arrive with shouting or threats, it arrived quietly, wrapped in official language, and it changed everything the moment I read the letter. The HOA informed me I was no longer allowed to speak at meetings, submit complaints, or question decisions. A quiet rule, they called it, designed to protect harmony. In reality, it erased my voice overnight. They expected compliance. They expected fear. What they didn't expect was curiosity. I had lived in the community for years without incident. I paid dues, followed guidelines, and minded my business. The problem began the day I asked where our money was going. Maintenance fees rose, repairs stalled, and explanations grew vague. The board smiled, nodded, and then stopped responding. Weeks later, the notice arrived. No warning. No vote. Just silence, delivered politely. Neighbors advised me to let it go. Some looked nervous just talking about it. Others admitted they'd received similar notices in the past. Everyone said the same thing, fighting the HOA never ends well. That fear was exactly why the rule worked. It didn't punish loudly, it isolated quietly. Instead of arguing, I started reading. I pulled out bylaws, amendments, archived meeting minutes, and old newsletters. I compared versions, dates, and wording. The quiet rule appeared suddenly, fully formed, without debate or explanation. It hadn't evolved. It had been inserted. And every time it appeared, someone had been asking uncomfortable questions. I followed the paper trail beyond the HOA. County records. Filing dates. Certification requirements. That's when I noticed something strange. The rule referenced an approval process required for any policy limiting homeowner participation. That process wasn't optional. It was mandatory. And according to public records, it had never been completed. At first, I assumed it was an oversight. But oversights don't repeat perfectly. The same missing step appeared again and again, across years of enforcement. The rule existed only inside HOA paperwork, never fully outside it. Silence, I realized, wasn't enforced by law. It was enforced by assumption. That realization changed how I felt completely. Fear dissolved into focus. If the rule had no authority, then neither did the silence. And if silence wasn't legitimate, then every decision made behind it deserved scrutiny. I stopped wondering whether I should continue and started wondering how far this went. Because if one quiet rule could erase voices so easily, it wasn't protecting harmony. It was protecting control. I understood then that this story wasn't just mine. It belonged to every homeowner who stayed quiet to survive. That knowledge carried weight, responsibility, and urgency, pushing me forward even when stopping felt safer. And once control depends on silence, exposure becomes inevitable. That was the moment everything truly began, and nothing would ever return to how it was before after that. Once the fear lifted, clarity followed. I stopped seeing the quiet rule as punishment and started seeing it as infrastructure. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't reactive. It was procedural, repeatable, and precise. That meant it left patterns, and patterns leave evidence. I began documenting everything the rule touched, every moment it appeared, and every consequence that followed its enforcement. I requested enforcement records from the HOA, expecting resistance. What I received instead were summaries, not originals. Dates without attachments. Decisions without votes. Language without signatures. Each file referenced authority but avoided proof. That avoidance told me more than any confession ever could. Rules with nothing to hide don't fear daylight. I started speaking quietly with neighbors. Not accusations. Just questions. Did they remember this rule being discussed? Did they recall voting on it? Most didn't. Some admitted they had been warned under it before. A few confessed they stopped attending meetings after receiving similar notices. Silence, it turned out, was contagious. The timeline grew clearer. Every enforcement followed a familiar sequence. A homeowner questioned spending. The board delayed answers. The quiet rule appeared. Communication stopped. Shortly after, expenses were approved with minimal discussion. Landscaping contracts. Consulting fees. Legal retainers. The amounts varied, but the timing never did. Silence created efficiency. I built charts linking enforcement dates to financial decisions. The correlations were undeniable. When dissent vanished, money moved faster. That didn't prove theft, but it proved incentive. And incentive explains behavior better than intent ever will. I expanded my search to former residents. People who had sold and moved away were more willing to talk. Many shared the same experience. Questions followed by warnings. Warnings followed by isolation. Isolation followed by exhaustion. Silence didn't just end conversations. It pushed people out quietly, cleanly, without conflict. One former board committee member agreed to meet privately. He reviewed my documents carefully, said very little, and returned them without comment. The next day, he resigned. No announcement. No explanation. His silence was confirmation enough. That's when I found the checklist. A procedural document referenced in the bylaws but never shared publicly. It outlined steps required before any rule limiting homeowner participation could be enforced. Verification. External acknowledgement. Recorded approval. None of it optional. None of it completed. The quiet rule had skipped every safeguard designed to prevent abuse. That wasn't accidental. Safeguards exist to slow power down. Someone had chosen speed instead. By then, I understood the truth fully. The HOA hadn't silenced me because I was disruptive. They silenced me because I was inconvenient. And inconvenience is dangerous to systems built on comfort, not accountability. I stopped asking whether the rule was valid and started asking who knew it wasn't. That question mattered more than anything else. Because ignorance creates mistakes. Knowledge creates responsibility. And responsibility, once proven, ends control completely. Finding out who knew the rule was invalid required stepping outside the HOA's control entirely. Internal records could always be explained away as confusion or poor organization. External records couldn't. So I filed formal requests with the county office responsible for recording HOA amendments and approvals. Unlike the board, the county didn't summarize, interpret, or soften language. They provided exactly what was filed, nothing more and nothing less. While I waited, the HOA's behavior changed noticeably. Emails arrived with softer language. Invitations to resolve misunderstandings privately appeared. Warnings about legal costs followed soon after. They weren't denying my claims. They were trying to slow me down. That told me I was close. When the county packet finally arrived, it was thinner than expected. Inside were certified copies of every HOA amendment on record. I laid them out in chronological order and compared them line by line with the versions the HOA had circulated internally. The difference was immediate. The quiet rule amendment existed, but it was incomplete. Pages referenced in the bylaws were missing. Verification sections were blank. Required attachments were never filed. One page mattered more than all the rest. The approval certification. According to HOA bylaws, any rule limiting homeowner participation required acknowledgement by an external authority before enforcement. That acknowledgement wasn't just missing. It had never been submitted. I called the county clerk directly. Her response was calm and definitive. If it's not in our system, it was never approved. And if it was never approved, it couldn't legally be enforced. She explained that partial filings sometimes occurred to meet deadlines, but enforcement before completion was prohibited. The HOA had never returned to finish the process. That meant the quiet rule had never legally existed. Every warning. Every fine. Every removal of speaking rights. All of it rested on authority that didn't exist outside HOA paperwork. Silence wasn't law. It was performance. I organized everything meticulously. Certified county documents. HOA versions. Bylaw excerpts. Timelines showing enforcement dates. I didn't share it publicly yet. One piece was still missing. Proof that the board knew the rule was incomplete and enforced it anyway. That proof surfaced in an unexpected place. Old email disclosures attached to a budget report. Buried in a thread between board members was a short exchange discussing the delay in final approval and agreeing it was safe to proceed quietly until resolved. That sentence changed everything. It eliminated doubt. They knew. And they enforced it anyway. At that moment, the story shifted. This wasn't mismanagement. It was control exercised without permission. Power borrowed from a rule that was never finalized. Once that truth existed on paper, the HOA lost its greatest defense, plausible ignorance. Silence only works when no one can prove it was intentional. I now could. The next step wasn't confrontation. It was exposure. And exposure, once it begins, doesn't stay contained. Exposure began quietly, the same way silence once did. I didn't post online or call reporters. I requested a formal agenda item for the next open HOA meeting, attaching county certifications as supporting material. They couldn't refuse without violating their own rules, so they scheduled it near the end, assuming most residents would leave early. That assumption was their first mistake. The room was full before the meeting even started. Neighbors stood along the walls, holding printed copies of documents I had shared privately. The board noticed immediately. The usual confidence was gone, replaced by forced smiles and careful wording. When my item was finally called, the president framed the quiet rule as procedural, well-intentioned, and misunderstood. He spoke slowly, avoiding words like approval, authority, or enforcement. I didn't argue. I displayed the county documents on the screen behind me. The missing certification. The incomplete filing. The bylaw section stating enforcement was prohibited without verification. I read the clerk's statement aloud, word for word. Silence filled the room, but this time it wasn't controlled. It was recognition. Questions followed quickly. A homeowner asked why she'd been fined under a rule that never legally existed. Another asked why his speaking rights were removed last year. Someone asked how many financial decisions passed after people were silenced. The board attempted to restore order, but order requires trust, and trust had just left the room. The meeting ended early, officially adjourned for legal review. Unofficially, it ended the board's authority. That night, emails flooded inboxes. Apologies. Clarifications. Promises to revisit enforcement actions. None of it mattered anymore. The quiet rule was no longer quiet. Within days, a petition circulated demanding an independent review of all actions taken under the rule. Signatures filled pages quickly, including names of people who once defended the board. Proof changes loyalty faster than persuasion ever can. The HOA's attorney resigned the following week. No explanation was given, but none was needed. That resignation confirmed what many suspected. This wasn't a fixable misunderstanding. It was a failure of governance. As outside attention grew, the board realized they weren't managing a disagreement anymore. They were facing documentation, timelines, and intent. Silence had protected them for years, but once exposed, it offered no defense at all. Control depends on belief. That night, belief collapsed. Afterward, conversations continued in driveways and kitchens, documents passing hand to hand. People compared notices, fines, and dates, recognizing shared experiences. Fear loosened its grip as understanding spread. The rule that once isolated now connected neighbors. Exposure created community, not chaos. By morning, control was gone, replaced by questions, resolve, and a demand for answers that could no longer be delayed or denied. Public accountability arrived, irreversible and permanent, at last for everyone involved there then. Accountability arrived not as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow tightening of rules, deadlines, and oversight that the board could no longer escape. The independent review formally began, and with it came requests the HOA couldn't ignore or delay. Originals replaced summaries. Attachments replaced explanations. Timelines replaced excuses. Each demand narrowed the space where silence once lived. Reviewers started with enforcement actions tied to the quiet rule. Case after case showed the same language, the same labels, the same outcome. Homeowners were declared disruptive, communication was cut, and decisions moved forward unchallenged. Consistency like that doesn't happen accidentally. It happens when a tool is being used exactly as designed. Financial auditors joined next, and their findings confirmed what the timeline suggested. Significant expenses were approved immediately after dissent disappeared. Consulting contracts. Emergency repairs. Legal retainers. None were outrageous alone, but together they formed a pattern of convenience. Silence created speed. Speed avoided scrutiny. Oversight vanished. Interviews made things worse for the board. Statements contradicted records. Memories conflicted with emails. One member claimed enforcement followed complaints, yet files showed none. Another said approval was assumed, not required. Assumption, the reviewers noted, was not a defense. Authority must be proven, not implied. Then draft documents surfaced. Early versions of the quiet rule, never shared publicly, discussed tone, timing, and selective use. Notes suggested deploying it only when necessary and avoiding attention by keeping enforcement administrative. Those words destroyed any remaining claim of confusion. Planning had occurred. Intent existed. The report's conclusions were direct. The quiet rule lacked authority, transparency, and compliance. All actions taken under it were subject to reversal. Refunds were recommended. Governance reforms were mandated. Most damaging of all, the board's credibility was formally questioned. Reactions came fast. 2 board members resigned quietly. Another stepped back, citing stress. Only one remained, issuing statements about misunderstanding and good faith. Few listened. Trust, once broken systematically, does not return through explanation. For homeowners, the moment was validating and painful at once. Years of self-doubt suddenly made sense. Silence had never been personal failure. It had been policy. Knowing that didn't erase the past, but it changed how people saw themselves. Control had ended not because someone shouted louder, but because documentation spoke clearly. And documentation, once read, cannot be unread. That shift reshaped meetings, relationships, and expectations across the neighborhood. People asked questions without apology and waited for sources, not assurances. Procedures slowed, but legitimacy returned. Decisions carried weight because they were witnessed. The quiet rule's power evaporated completely. What replaced it was imperfect but honest participation, sustained by records, verification, and shared memory, ensuring control could never quietly reassemble in the dark again for future boards, homeowners, and communities learning vigilance through transparency together everywhere today right now. With the report finalized, authority shifted decisively. The HOA was no longer steering the process, it was responding to it. Oversight bodies issued formal directives requiring immediate compliance. Enforcement under the quiet rule was permanently suspended, and every decision connected to it was flagged for review. What once felt untouchable was now procedural, measurable, and accountable. Refund notices went out first. Not only for fines, but for administrative fees linked to enforced silence. Checks arrived quietly in mailboxes, accompanied by formal letters acknowledging improper enforcement. For many homeowners, the money mattered less than the words. It was the first time the HOA admitted, in writing, that it had acted without authority. Next came governance changes. Supervised elections were ordered, with external observers present. Ballots were verified. Procedures were documented. No shortcuts. No assumptions. People who had once avoided meetings now stood to run for positions. The room felt different. Not tense, but deliberate. Authority was no longer inherited. It had to be earned publicly. The remaining board member attempted one last maneuver. He proposed retroactive approval of the quiet rule, arguing it would correct a technical oversight and stabilize the community. The proposal lasted less than 5 minutes. Advisors shut it down immediately. Retroactive authority is an admission of prior illegitimacy. It fixes nothing. It exposes everything. Insurance providers stepped in next. Coverage was re-evaluated. Policy renewals were conditioned on structural reforms. Vendors were reviewed. Contracts approved during periods of silenced opposition were reopened. Some were renegotiated. Others were terminated. Silence had smoothed deals. Transparency complicated them. That complication was intentional. What surprised many was how quickly behavior changed once oversight became constant. Documents were shared without resistance. Questions were answered directly. Meetings ran longer, but with fewer conflicts. When people trust the process, they don't need to fight the outcome as hard. I was asked repeatedly if I felt satisfied. The honest answer was complicated. Exposure had ended control, but it had also revealed how fragile governance becomes when people assume authority is permanent. The quiet rule didn't work because it was clever. It worked because no one believed it could be questioned. The community began rebuilding with that lesson in mind. New policies required automatic expiration unless reaffirmed publicly. Participation became a requirement, not an obstacle. Silence could no longer maintain power over time. It had a deadline. Former board members faded from visibility. Some avoided the neighborhood. Others tried to rewrite the past as misunderstanding. But the record remained. Memory became protection. What replaced control wasn't chaos. It was patience. Decisions slowed. Debates deepened. Trust returned gradually, reinforced by access and verification. Silence lost its appeal once people understood how easily it could be constructed. And that understanding changed everything going forward. Rebuilding trust required more than removing a rule, it required changing habits formed under silence. Even with reforms in place, people hesitated at first. Old instincts lingered. Questions were softened. Emails were rewritten twice before sending. Silence had trained caution deeply, and undoing that training took time, patience, and consistency from everyone involved. The new board understood this immediately. They didn't rush declarations of success. Instead, they focused on predictability. Agendas were published early. Documents were shared in full, not summarized. Meetings ran longer than before, sometimes uncomfortably so, but no one was rushed. Time replaced pressure. Process replaced personality. One of the most important changes was deceptively simple. Any homeowner could request the source document behind any rule, fee, or decision, without explanation or penalty. No labels. No tracking. Just access. That single shift removed fear faster than any apology ever could. Participation grew steadily. People who once sat quietly now raised their hands. Disagreements happened openly, but without hostility. Losing a vote no longer felt like punishment, because voices were still heard. That distinction changed the tone of everything. I noticed something else too. Power no longer clustered around personalities. It flowed through procedures. When someone asked, why, the answer wasn't defensive. It was documented. Authority stopped being personal and became verifiable. Former board members became a quiet reference point. Not villains, but reminders. Their absence wasn't celebrated. It was instructive. The community understood now that good intentions don't replace oversight, and comfort doesn't justify control. New homeowners were welcomed differently as well. Instead of being handed rules and warnings, they were given explanations. They were shown where records lived and how to access them. Transparency wasn't reactive anymore. It was cultural. Months passed, and the quiet rule faded into history, but its lesson stayed active. Silence was no longer assumed to mean agreement. When meetings grew calm, people leaned in instead of relaxing. Calm became a moment to verify, not to disengage. I was asked once whether I regretted pushing so hard. The answer surprised me. I didn't feel like I had pushed. I had followed. Followed documents. Followed procedures. Followed questions to their logical end. The resistance had come from trying to stop that process, not from beginning it. What ultimately replaced control was confidence. Not confidence in leadership, but confidence in access. People trusted themselves again. They trusted their ability to check, confirm, and question without fear of erasure. That confidence made the system resilient. Quiet power cannot survive where verification is normal. And once verification becomes habit, silence loses its meaning entirely. The final transformation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, ordinary, durable. And it prepared the community for the one truth that remained to be faced next. As the community settled into its new rhythm, something unexpected surfaced. Awareness spread beyond our neighborhood. Homeowners from nearby HOAs began reaching out quietly, asking how to check their own rules, where to find filings, what questions were safe to ask. Many had their own version of a quiet rule, called something else but functioning the same way. Silence, it turned out, was a shared design. I started helping them read. Not interpreting, not accusing, just pointing to where authority must be proven. County records. Approval clauses. Verification requirements. The same pattern appeared again and again. Rules that existed internally but stopped short of legal completion. Power that depended on no one checking the final step. What surprised me most was how relieved people felt when they discovered this. Fear thrives on uncertainty. Once uncertainty is replaced with documentation, fear weakens. Even when people found nothing wrong, the act of checking changed how they related to authority. They stopped assuming. They started confirming. Back home, the HOA introduced its final reform, an automatic disclosure trigger. Any rule or decision affecting homeowner rights would prompt an immediate public posting of its legal basis. No request required. Transparency became proactive. Silence could no longer form in gaps. Meetings continued to evolve. They weren't perfect. Debates still stalled. Frustration still surfaced. But disagreements happened in daylight. That alone prevented escalation. Problems were addressed early, not buried quietly. One evening, I walked past the bulletin board where the quiet rule once hung, framed and unquestioned. In its place was a simple notice listing where governing documents could be accessed and how to request clarification. No warnings. No threats. Just information. The absence felt symbolic. I realized then that the rule had failed long before it was exposed. It failed the moment someone read past the headline and into the footnotes. It failed because it relied on exhaustion, not legitimacy. And exhaustion is temporary. The most lasting change wasn't structural. It was internal. People trusted their instincts again. If something felt wrong, they checked. If something felt unclear, they asked. Silence lost its camouflage. Looking back, I understood why the HOA never expected this outcome. Control often assumes people want comfort more than truth. It underestimates curiosity. Curiosity doesn't rush. It doesn't confront immediately. It waits, collects, and connects. The quiet rule was designed to end conversations. Instead, it started many. Not just here, but elsewhere. That ripple effect mattered more than any resignation or refund. It meant the lesson traveled. The community didn't become louder. It became sharper. Words mattered more. Documents mattered more. Authority had to earn attention continuously. Only one chapter remained. Not about the HOA, or the rule, or even control. But about what silence teaches once it's broken, and why it never returns to its original form again. The silence that remained after everything was over felt unfamiliar, but not threatening. It wasn't imposed. It wasn't strategic. It was earned calm. The kind that exists only when people know they can speak at any moment and choose not to. That distinction changed how the community understood quiet forever. At the final annual meeting, attendance was higher than it had ever been. Not because people expected conflict, but because participation had become habit. Reports were presented clearly. Questions were asked without hesitation. Disagreements happened respectfully, in public, where they belonged. No one rushed to adjourn. No one tried to control the room. Authority no longer needed protection. One homeowner stood and shared something that captured everything. She said she used to believe staying quiet kept her safe. Now she understood it only kept others comfortable. The room stayed silent for a moment, not out of fear, but recognition. Everyone understood exactly what she meant. What ended the HOA's control wasn't exposure alone. It was education. Once people learned how authority is built, they stopped mistaking confidence for legitimacy. They learned to look for verification, not reassurance. That skill stayed with them, long after the quiet rule disappeared. New homeowners were told the story openly. Not as gossip, not as a warning, but as context. They were shown how to access records, how to request documentation, and how to question decisions without fear. Silence was no longer mysterious. It was explainable. Preventable. I was asked more than once if I felt victorious. The answer was always no. There was no victory moment. No dramatic ending. Just a steady realization that control collapses the moment people stop assuming it's permanent. The quiet rule didn't fail because it was challenged loudly. It failed because it was read carefully. Looking back, the most unsettling part wasn't the rule itself. It was how ordinary it was. No villain speeches. No obvious corruption. Just a shortcut taken repeatedly because no one pushed back. Until someone did. The HOA still exists. Rules still exist. Disagreements still happen. But one belief is gone forever. The belief that silence equals legitimacy. That idea lost its power the moment people learned how easily silence can be constructed. What replaced it wasn't chaos or rebellion. It was attention. Attention to process. Attention to language. Attention to missing steps. Attention is quiet, but it's powerful. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It simply notices. And once people learn to notice, control has an expiration date. That is the real ending of this story. Not revenge. Not punishment. But awareness that lasts. Because when silence is understood, it can no longer be used as a weapon. It becomes just another sound people know how to hear.